Welcome to Sherlock Tales, where every mystery comes alive. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with your fellow mystery lovers. Tell us in the comments, which part of the world are you watching from? Let's solve mysteries together.
It was on a grey morning in late October that I, Dr. John H. Watson, found myself once more seated opposite Sherlock Holmes in the familiar sitting room of 221B BakerStreet. Outside, a light drizzle cast glistening streaks across the window panes, blurring the outline of the gas lamps and sending a soft chill into the hearth-warmed room. Holmes was in one of his more contemplative moods, lounging in his armchair in a cloud of Turkish tobacco, his long fingers steepled under his chin as his gaze drifted toward some far-off mental theatre. I'd only just returned from Paddington, where I'd seen off a patient of mine to the West Country. I'd hoped for a quiet morning, perhaps even a round of backgammon, but Holmes's silence hinted otherwise. He had not spoken since I arrived, and as the minutes lengthened, I turned at last to break the spell. "You seem preoccupied, Holmes." His grey eyes flicked to me with the briefest gleam of amusement. "Only mildly so, Watson. I was just calculating the precise weight of the boot polish your new patient tracked across our carpet. Judging by the angle and pressure of his stride, he is either favoring his left leg or concealing a hip wound." I laughed. It is always reassuring to know your mind has lost none of its peculiar edge. Before Holmes could respond, there came a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson's muffled voice followed. "A gentleman to see Mr. Holmes." We both looked up as a curious figure entered the room a moment later. He was a man in his early 50s, dressed in an immaculately pressed dark green overcoat with silver toggles that gleamed faintly in the lamplight. His hat was of a provincial style, not quite fashionable in London, and his boots, Holmes would no doubt comment on them soon, were lightly caked with pale clay. But it was the object in his hands that captured our attention. A birthday cake. It was a modest thing, round and plainly iced, with 7 small blue candles sunk into its top. The faint scent of vanilla and almond followed the man into the room. He looked uncomfortable holding it, as if he had not meant to arrive with it still in his possession. "Mr. Holmes?" he said, his voice low and weathered. "My name is Harold Lavington. I was told to come to you. They said if anyone could make sense of what I've seen, it would be you." Holmes rose slowly. "Please, Mr. Lavington, set the cake down. I do not believe we require refreshments. Yet." Lavington chuckled faintly, though it was tinged with unease. He placed the cake on the small table beside Holmes's violin case, then sat heavily in the chair I offered. "It's not a jest," he said quickly. "The cake, I mean. I realize it seems absurd, but I swear to you something is terribly wrong." Holmes sank back into his chair, eyes now sharply alert. "Begin at the beginning, Mr. Lavington, and leave out nothing, however trivial it may appear." The man nodded. "I'm a steward, sir. Have been for nearly 20 years. I manage the estate of Lord Milbray up in Northumberland. He's a kind employer, distant to be sure, but fair." "Aged," Holmes interjected. 62, but he's been in declining health these past 3 years. Heart issues. His physician, Dr. Ramsay, visits twice weekly now." "And the cake?" Holmes said gently. Lavington leaned forward. "That's just it. Lord Milbray's birthday is in June, always has been. But 2 nights ago, someone left this on the front steps of the manor house. No name, no card. Just this cake, boxed neatly in white paper. It had 7 blue candles in it, all unlit. No one had come to the door, the staff had been indoors the entire evening, and yet there it was, fresh and still warm when discovered by the maid." Watson and I exchanged glances. Holmes, meanwhile, was examining the cake with open fascination. "It would be strange enough," Lavington continued, "were it not for what happened the next day. Lord Milbray collapsed during breakfast. No warning, no exertion, just down he went. He's alive, thank God, but unconscious. Dr. Ramsay can't explain it. He says it's not his heart. Holmes's fingers drummed against the armrest. And the household? Agitated. Frightened, if I'm honest. It's not the first strange occurrence this week. 3 nights ago, the library was found open at dawn, though Lord Milbray always locks it before retiring. A window had been unlatched, but nothing was taken. And a week before that, one of the horses was found dead in its stall. Again, no wounds, no illness beforehand. Watson said softly, "You suspect someone means harm to Lord Milbray." Lavington looked down. "I don't know what I suspect, Doctor, but someone left a birthday cake for a man whose birthday was 4 months ago, and now he's hovering between life and death. That strikes me as more than coincidence." Holmes rose and walked to the cake. He circled it slowly, studying its surface with such intensity, I wondered if he could read it like a printed page. "Who had access to the front of the house that night?" "No one, sir. We were all indoors. I made sure the gates were locked at dusk, and the footman swore he checked them before bed." "No recent guests?" "Only Miss Carroway. She's Lord Milbray's niece. Came up from London 2 weeks ago. She tends to him most evenings." "Close with her uncle?" Lavington hesitated. "They used to be. But lately I've overheard raised voices. She wants him to change his will." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Ah." Lavington shook his head. "But she wouldn't do this. She's impulsive, yes, but not cruel." Holmes turned away from the cake. "Every detail, Mr. Lavington. Did anything accompany the cake? A note, a symbol?" "Nothing but a napkin folded beneath the box. I brought it as well." He reached into his coat pocket and removed a square of soft linen, which Holmes took carefully in gloved fingers. There, faint but unmistakable, was a small embroidered figure in pale blue thread, 7 candles arranged in a circle, their wicks forming the shape of an eye. Holmes let out a sharp breath. "Curious, extremely curious." He straightened. "Mr. Lavington, I shall accompany you to Northumberland on the 10:15 express tomorrow. Please ensure the cake remains untouched and tell no one of your visit to BakerStreet, not even Miss Carroway. I believe we are dealing with something far more deliberate than superstition." Lavington looked relieved. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I don't know what we're facing, but I feel better already knowing you're involved." As he took his leave, the scent of almond and vanilla lingered faintly behind him. Holmes stood unmoving for several minutes, his gaze fixed not on the cake, but on the napkin, now laid flat upon the desk. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you recall the affair of the Candlemark manuscript?" I frowned. "Only vaguely. A forged codex and an apothecary in Kent, if memory serves." "Precisely. The symbol on this cloth appeared once before, in the margins of a page falsely attributed to the 14th century. It was dismissed then as fanciful embroidery. But I begin to suspect—" He did not finish the thought. Instead, he stepped to the fire and drew the curtain shut. Whatever lay ahead in Northumberland, it would not be a simple matter of cake and candles. The following morning dawned clear and cold, with the London fog briefly lifted to reveal a sky of pale blue streaked with high wisps of cloud. Holmes was already dressed and at the breakfast table when I descended the stairs, his plate untouched save for a solitary egg, which he had dismantled with forensic precision but made no attempt to consume. "I trust your bag is packed, Watson," he said, not looking up from the paper he had folded twice lengthwise, eyes scanning the columns without truly reading them. I poured myself a cup of coffee. "It is, though I confess I'm still wrestling with the idea that a cake, however strangely timed, could be anything more than a bizarre prank." Holmes finally lowered the paper. His expression sharpened with something more than mere curiosity. "When an object is chosen for its banality, Watson, that is often when it most deserves scrutiny. A pistol on a man's nightstand arouses suspicion. But a birthday cake on a doorstep—" He tapped the paper. "That is the mark of someone who understands appearances and how to use them to cloak intent." The journey to Northumberland was uneventful, though Holmes remained largely silent during the ride. I could see his mind ticking behind his grey eyes as he turned the details over in that ceaseless engine of deduction he carried within him. Once, he murmured to himself, something about 7 flames and the eye turned inward. But he did not elaborate, and I did not press him. We arrived at Milbrae Manor as the sun was beginning its descent, casting long golden streaks across the moorland. The house was a fine old structure, Victorian Gothic in design, with narrow windows and a central tower that gave the impression of watching one's approach. A single wisp of smoke curled from a side chimney. Otherwise, the house seemed as still as the stones surrounding it. Harold Lavington met us at the door, the same anxious energy about him, though he seemed buoyed somewhat by our presence. "Dr. Ramsay is with Lord Milbrae now," he said as he led us through the vestibule. "Still unconscious. No change in his condition since my visit to you." "And the cake?" Holmes asked. "In the pantry, untouched, as instructed. The napkin is locked in my drawer." "Good." As we moved through the house, I took quiet note of the atmosphere. The staff moved lightly, voices hushed, eyes flicking toward closed doors. Something clung to the manor, a sense not of grief, but of dread. The air itself seemed to carry a kind of stillness that one associates more with a cathedral than a home. Holmes turned to Lavington. "And Miss Carroway?" "She's upstairs. I told her only that we were expecting visitors." "Introduce us as friends of Lord Milbrae, travelling from London with interest in his recovery. Do not mention my profession or name just yet." We found Miss Edith Carroway seated in the upper drawing-room, near the wide windows overlooking the autumn-coloured grounds. She was younger than I'd imagined, perhaps no older than 30, with pale features, intelligent blue eyes, and a certain rigidity in her posture that suggested either intense self-possession or deep discomfort. "Miss Carroway," Lavington said, gesturing. "May I introduce Mr. Mycroft and Dr. Whodunit?" Holmes gave no sign of amusement at the assumed name, though I noted the faintest flicker of interest in the young woman's eyes. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion," Holmes said, bowing. "Mr. Lavington tells us that your uncle is most unwell." "He is," she replied quietly. "He has not opened his eyes since Tuesday. It's very unlike him. May I ask, has he suffered anything similar in the past?" "Fainting spells, occasionally. But nothing of this magnitude. His heart is fragile, yes, but he was lucid just the evening before. We had a disagreement, and then the next morning—" Her voice trailed off, and for a moment I thought she might cry, but she did not. Instead, she rose and walked toward the window. "You're friends of his?" "Distant ones," Holmes replied, more interested in peculiar circumstances than bloodlines. That drew her gaze. "Then I imagine Harold told you about the cake." "He did, and the timing does seem deliberate." Her expression grew unreadable. "You think someone's trying to harm my uncle?" Holmes considered her carefully before answering. "Let us say I find the details sufficiently irregular to warrant examination." "Good," she said sharply, "because no one here seems willing to believe it. Not the doctor, not the staff, but I know my uncle. And I know something is wrong." There was a pause before she turned to leave. "I hope you find answers, Mr. Mycroft. If you'll excuse me, I promised I would sit with him before supper." When she had gone, I turned to Holmes. "Do you believe her?" "She's clever," he replied, "and either telling the truth or an extremely capable actress. Both possibilities require our attention." We descended to the kitchen, where Lavington produced the cake from the pantry with the same cautious reverence one might reserve for an unexploded shell. Holmes did not touch it directly. He used a pair of tweezers to extract a single sliver from the icing, placing it into a small glass vial. "Almond," I said. "Strong scent. Not just almond, Watson. Bitter almond." He sniffed the cake. then examined it with a small magnifying lens. There is a mild dusting here, near the base. Possibly powdered stone fruit kernel, though not enough to be lethal. And yet, it was not meant to be eaten, was it? No one has, I reminded him. Precisely. The threat lies not in the ingestion, but the symbolism. 7 candles, unlit. Bitter almond. A napkin bearing the all-seeing eye composed of flames. This is theatre, Watson. A performance for someone watching closely. And the audience. Holmes straightened. I suspect we are not the intended viewers, but we've been granted access nonetheless. That night we were shown to modest guest quarters at the east end of the house. Holmes barely rested. Around midnight I found him by candlelight sketching the design from the embroidered napkin repeatedly, muttering under his breath. When I asked what troubled him, he said only, a symbol older than the manor itself, but reused, repurposed. The following morning, Holmes requested a private walk around the manor grounds, and Lavington, though puzzled, obliged. As we passed through the rear garden and approached the old carriage house, Holmes paused abruptly. "Observe the stonework there," he said, pointing. "See the archway? There's a stone above it, half buried beneath lichen." I squinted and saw it then, a carved relief, worn nearly to smoothness, yet unmistakable once one knew what to seek. 7 candles, arranged in a circle. "The same motif," I whispered. "Older than embroidery, older than cakes. Watson, I believe this manor was chosen not merely as a home, but as a theatre. The performance may have begun now, but the stage was set long before." Just then, a soft clatter behind us caused us both to turn sharply. From the path we'd just taken, a figure fled. Short, hunched, moving with unnatural speed. Holmes gave chase at once, and I followed close behind. The figure darted into the side hedge maze, barely tall, enough to obscure the head, and disappeared. When we emerged into the center, the clearing was empty. But lying on the grass was another napkin, identical to the first, save for one key difference. Only 6 candles, and one was burning, not embroidered, but real, drawn in soot as if from the tip of a blackened match. Holmes held it up with reverent care, his expression unreadable. "Now, Watson," he murmured, "the clock has begun." And he turned with a swiftness that startled me, heading back toward the manor with purpose in his stride. Whatever game was being played here, Holmes had accepted his role within it, and I, as always, followed. By the time we returned to the manor with the soot-marked napkin in hand, the sky had darkened to a somber slate, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Holmes moved quickly, his gait precise, though his mind was clearly racing ahead of his feet. He said nothing until we reached the study, where he laid the second napkin beside the first on the writing desk and examined them under the glow of a gas lamp. "There is no mistake," he said, more to himself than to me. "The first shows 7 unlit candles arranged in a perfect eye. This one, 6 unlit, one aflame, but drawn crudely, improvised, soot from a struck match. A message, but not a subtle one." I leaned in, studying the lines. "A countdown." Holmes looked up at me, his face grave. "Yes, Watson. I believe someone has begun a sequence, each flame representing a step, a warning, or perhaps a toll. And this one burned. Tells us that the first act is complete. You think this was left for us? After we left the cake untouched? I think," he said slowly, "that it was left for someone watching, perhaps Miss Carroway, perhaps someone else entirely. But we intercepted it. That may change the tempo of events." Before I could reply, there was a knock at the study door. Lavington entered, his brow knit with tension. "Forgive the interruption, but Dr. Ramsay has asked to speak with you. Both of you, in fact. He's in the east corridor, just outside Lord Milbray's room." We followed Lavington quickly through the hall, past heavy velvet drapes and ancestral portraits that seemed to glower at our intrusion. The house had grown quieter still, the sort of silence that blankets a household in distress. Dr. Ramsay awaited us near a carved oak door, his hands folded in front of him. He was a trim man in his early 60s, with a physician's careful expression and the clipped speech of someone accustomed to authority. "I was told you're friends of the family," he began, without preamble. "I must say, your timing is interesting, and your presence, unannounced, is somewhat irregular." Holmes bowed faintly. "Forgive the informality. We were summoned by Mr. Lavington on an urgent matter. We mean no disrespect, only assistance." Dr. Ramsay's lips pressed together into a line of mild irritation. "I've done all that can be done for Lord Milbray. His collapse is not cardiac in origin. That much is certain. I've tested for poisons, arsenic, digitalis, even laudanum, all negative. His respiration is shallow but stable. His pulse is weak, though consistent. He is unreachable, but not dying." Holmes inclined his head. "A curious state, not unconscious, not poisoned, as if placed in some unnatural sleep." Ramsay frowned. "There are neurological conditions that can result in catatonia, but none explain the suddenness of his collapse, nor the absence of any preceding symptoms." "May I see him?" Holmes asked. Reluctantly, Ramsay opened the door. The room beyond was dim, lit only by a lamp near the bedside. Lord Milbray lay motionless beneath a wool blanket, his features pale and slack. He was breathing, yes, but only just. Each rise and fall of his chest was shallow, mechanical, as though performed by habit rather than vitality. Holmes approached slowly, examining the man not with the eyes of a physician, but of a scientist observing the effects of a mechanism. He lifted Milbray's right hand, turned it gently, and let it fall back onto the coverlid. "He looks," Holmes murmured, "as though he has been drained. Not physically, but volitionally, as if the machinery of his will has been tampered with." Dr. Ramsay bristled. "Pardon me, but that sounds more metaphysical than medical." "Quite so," Holmes said, unbothered. "But the metaphysical, when weaponized, can sometimes produce the most physical of consequences." Holmes then turned to the windows. They were tightly latched, the curtains drawn. He studied the floorboards, ran his hand along the stone windowsill, and paused at a small wooden writing desk in the corner. "This was moved recently," he said, gesturing. "See the scuff marks?" Dr. Ramsay glanced. "Possibly. The maid may have cleaned beneath it." Holmes opened the desk drawer and extracted a sheaf of folded letters bound with a green ribbon. He did not open them, only studied the paper, its watermark, and the way the ribbon had been retied. These were read recently, and not by Lord Milbray. Ramsay said nothing. Holmes placed the letters back precisely and closed the drawer. "Thank you for your time, Doctor. I will disturb the patient no further." As we left the room, Holmes paused outside the door, glancing once down the corridor. "There are movements in this house," he said quietly. "Not malevolent in appearance, but methodical. Someone wants Lord Milbray incapacitated, not dead, which makes him more useful in silence than in speech. What do you suppose is in those letters? Something the perpetrator fears he might share. A secret, Watson, possibly one that links all of this. The cake, the napkins, the countdown. We must find out what Lord Milbray knew." Back in the study, Holmes resumed his position at the desk and removed a notebook from his coat. He drew both napkins again, this time altering the angles of the flames and their orientation. He turned the drawings clockwise, then upside down, as though trying to make them speak. "There is pattern here," he said. "Symbolic, but practical. A language meant to signal steps. The first candle was left unlit. Now one is marked as burned. 6 remain. But what do they mark time toward?" Before I could offer a theory, Lavington entered again, more breathless this time. "Mr. Holmes, you asked me to inform you of any changes." "Yes?" There's been another one. Holmes stood at once. Another napkin. Number something worse. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, has vanished. Vanished? Her quarters were empty this morning, her bed untouched. No one has seen her since late last night. Her keys are missing from the hook, and the servant's stairwell was found unlocked. Holmes turned sharply, retrieving his coat. Search the grounds. Start with the north hedge and the well house. If she has been taken or frightened into fleeing, we must know which. What shall I tell the others? Lavington asked. Nothing yet, Holmes said. Keep order. Appear calm, but if this is the second step, then we are already behind. As Lavington left to raise a discreet search, Holmes turned to me, his expression grim. This is not the work of a madman, Watson. This is a rehearsal, a ritual, each act prepared in advance, each move calculated to unsettle rather than destroy. But someone is tightening the circle. 7 candles, 1 man falls. Now a woman disappears. And what happens when the 7th candle is lit? Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his pipe and lit it slowly, staring through the curling smoke at the space between the 2 napkins. I fear, he said, that this house has a history no one wants to remember. But it has remembered itself, and someone is following the script. He took a long breath. Before this day ends, Watson, we must find out who wrote it. The search for Mrs. Fenwick began with the discretion Holmes had insisted upon, though unease had already begun to thread its way into the manor's corridors. Holmes and I descended the narrow servants' staircase, our boots echoing lightly along the stone steps as we entered the lower wing. The air was colder here, untouched by the hearths above. Holmes moved swiftly through the laundry room, the scullery, and the pantry, observing with a quiet, surgical attention that seemed to note even the subtle displacement of a mop or the faint drag mark on a tiled floor. He stopped before a side door that led to the exterior path curving toward the hedge maze. The bolt was drawn back. She left willingly, Holmes murmured, or was led out without force. I bent to examine the threshold. There are no signs of struggle. But look at the mud here. Fresh from the moor path. And, see, 2 different depths. She walked out, but someone larger followed. We stepped into the chill morning, the sky blanketed by a low, sullen mist. Holmes led the way along the hedgerow path until we reached the fork leading toward the well house. A thread of dark cloth clung to the lower thorn of a nearby hedge. Holmes plucked it free. Wool, midnight blue. The housekeeper wore a navy shawl yesterday evening. We followed the narrow path until it widened slightly before the well house, an aged stone structure roofed with slate and long disused. Holmes crouched near the door, examining the iron handle, and then turned to the moss-damp ground. Watson. I stepped forward. In the earth, just before the threshold, were footprints. 2 sets again. One small, narrow, pressed lightly. The other deeper, more urgent, the heels digging in as though in pursuit. Holmes reached into his coat and produced a small length of twine and a measuring stick. He marked the depth and span of each print with efficiency, murmuring to himself. A woman, followed by a man, perhaps taller, certainly heavier, but see here, only the smaller prints re-emerge from the structure. She went in, I said slowly, but the one who followed her did not. Holmes rose, his eyes narrowed. Or he left another way. Come. He pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the well house was dark and close. A single window filtered in the weak grey light. In the center stood the old stone well, capped by a rotted wooden cover with rusted remnants of a crank and rope hanging limply above. Dust coated most surfaces, but not all. Holmes stepped forward and pointed to the windowsill. A second napkin lay there, this one partially torn and dusted with ash. 6 candles again, but now 2 were marked with soot. This is not a warning, Holmes said. It is a ritual, and it is accelerating. I turned toward the well. The wooden cover had been disturbed, scratches along the edge, as though recently shifted. Holmes noticed too, and without waiting, he stepped forward and removed the cover. The space beneath yawned black and deep, but no foul smell emerged. No body, no dreadful confirmation. Instead, a length of twine had been knotted and anchored inside, leading down into the gloom. Holmes fetched a lantern from a wall hook and lit it with a match. Then, without hesitation, he began descending. "Holmes!" I cried. "You can't be serious." But he was already gone, his lean frame swallowed by the stone shaft. I hesitated only a moment before following. The descent was slow and damp, the lantern swinging lightly from my shoulder as I lowered myself by the rope. At last, my boots touched sodden stone and Holmes's voice echoed faintly from a few yards away. "This was used recently," he called. "Someone has been storing things down here." I moved toward the glow of his lantern, and together we stood in a small circular chamber at the base of the well. Crates lined one wall, old, dust-covered, save for one, recently opened. Inside were several folded napkins, all identical in design to the ones we had found, and a half-empty bottle of ink. Holmes picked up a small ledger from the crate, flipping through its dampened pages. Blank, except for the last 3 entries. Ignis Unus, then Fenwick, then Pars Secunda Completa. Latin? Yes. First flame. Fenwick, second part, complete. He turned slowly to me. "The victim has not been killed. She has been counted as part of something staged, something serialized." Holmes closed the ledger. "Let us return. This well is not merely an old ruin. It is a storeroom, possibly even a place of rehearsal." We climbed out in silence, and once we emerged, the wind had begun to stir the leaves into rustling waves across the grass. Back at the manor, a subdued panic had begun to spread among the staff. Rumors of Mrs. Fenwick's disappearance had circulated despite Lavington's efforts. Miss Carroway met us in the lower hall, her face pale but composed. "I heard," she said. "The housekeeper. And the symbol again." Holmes studied her carefully. "Miss Carroway, you must tell me plainly. What is it you fear?" She took a long breath, glancing once behind her before stepping closer. "There's a legend tied to this house. Nothing more than old talk, really. Something passed down through the generations of the estate's staff. A story about 7 flames, 7 sins, and an ancient reckoning. When I was a child, the maids would whisper of it after dark. They said that long ago, one of our ancestors conducted rites, ceremonies, down in the lower cellar. The story was always vague. But it ended with the warning that if ever the 7 flames returned, the family line would break forever." "Rites?" Holmes asked sharply. "What sort?" No one knew. They called it the Vigil of the Candles. Supposedly, the 7th marked the final judgment. But I always assumed it was just a child's tale. I never thought... "Until a stranger left a cake on the doorstep with 7 candles," Holmes said. She looked at him, stricken. "You think this is connected to that story?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that someone is using it. Whether they believe in the legend or merely find it a convenient framework, I do not yet know. But they are playing by its rules, and those rules are being enforced." There was a long silence. Holmes turned back toward the study. "I must examine the family records. Something from that past, real or imagined, has inspired this pattern." Miss Carroway hesitated. "There are old estate ledgers in the tower room. Few people go there now. I can take you." He nodded. "Do so at once." As she left to retrieve the keys, Holmes turned to me, voice low. "She is holding something back, Watson. Not out of malice, but guilt, perhaps, or fear." I glanced toward the stairwell. "And if we reach the 5th flame before the truth emerges?" Holmes looked at me darkly. Then we will not be solving a mystery. We will be attending the final act. Miss Carroway returned 10 minutes later with a ring of iron keys in her hand and a tautness in her features that suggested more than fatigue. Without a word, she led us up the main staircase, past the gallery of family portraits, whose eyes seemed to track our movement, and toward a narrower flight of stone steps that wound into the central tower. The air grew cooler with each ascent, and the dust grew thicker, as though no one had ventured up here in months, if not years. At the top, she unlocked a heavy oak door with a groan of iron hinges, revealing a circular room ringed with cabinets, wooden chests, and a vast central desk half covered in faded ledgers and curling documents. Cobwebs laced the rafters, and the scent of old parchment and time-soaked timber clung to the space. "This is what remains of the family archive," she said quietly. "The older papers, pre-1800, are mostly lost or crumbled. But there may be something here." Holmes stepped inside at once and began surveying the stacks with focused urgency, his long fingers trailing across bindings as if trying to summon their contents by touch alone. I joined him in silence, and together we began sorting through yellowed records, handwritten inventories, and family correspondence. "Watson," Holmes murmured, lifting a brittle leather-bound journal from beneath a pile. "Here, look at the seal." I leaned over. Embossed on the inside cover was a faded wax imprint, an eye surrounded by 7 rays or flames, unmistakably similar to the napkin motif. Beneath it was a scrawled inscription in old ink, of the vigil and the binding of the line. Holmes turned the pages carefully, his eyes scanning the antiquated penmanship with increasing sharpness. It appears to be a journal of one Silas Milbray, an ancestor dating back to 1769. He writes of visions, of voices from the marshes, and of candles lit to seal a pact of silence. I frowned. Madness? Possibly. Or guilt? Listen. First the tongue, then the breath, then the hand. The flames took their turn, and in their taking, I was spared. Holmes looked up. "Watson?" He believed each candle marked a form of sacrifice or silencing. The tongue for speech, the breath for life, the hand for agency. It's symbolism, but someone is echoing it with terrifying precision. Miss Carroway hovered near the door, arms folded tightly. "I never read that far." "I didn't know." Holmes closed the book slowly. The vigil was not merely a tale. It was a method. A way to bury something, and now it has been disinterred. We returned downstairs, the journal carefully wrapped in a cloth. As we passed the corridor leading to Lord Milbray's room, Holmes slowed. The door was slightly ajar. He approached soundlessly and peered in. A nurse was changing the linens, her face blank with fatigue. Lord Milbray remained unchanged, pale, unmoving. But Holmes stepped inside and motioned for the nurse to leave a moment. As the door clicked shut, he approached the bedside and held the ancestor's journal out over the still form. "You see, Watson," he said softly, "the only way to stir a memory is to show it its reflection." Then he leaned in and placed the old book gently on the coverlet. "Let us give the unconscious mind a whisper of its past." Nothing happened. But as we turned to leave, Holmes glanced once more toward the windowsill and froze. A folded square of linen had been placed there during our brief absence. No one had entered the room but us and the nurse, and yet the napkin was there, weighted with a pebble, stark against the glass. We stepped to it, and Holmes unfolded it with gloved fingers. 5 unlit candles, 2 marked with soot, one now torn through the center. Holmes' voice was like flint striking stone. Someone was just here, while we were upstairs. I moved to the hallway, eyes searching, but the corridor was empty. Holmes examined the sill. Dust displaced. Just minutes ago. This message wasn't left by accident. It was meant to be discovered before the next. What does the tear mean? I asked. A warning or a punishment. The second act complete, the third initiated. But the nature of it, destruction, not simply marking. Whoever orchestrates this is no longer content with subtlety. They are escalating. At that moment, a cry echoed from the lower hall. Lavington's voice, sharp and disbelieving. We rushed down to find him outside the drawing room, gesturing frantically toward the glass doors that led to the south terrace. "She's gone," he said. "Miss Carroway, I saw her through the window just now, walking into the fog. She was barefoot." Holmes pushed past us and flung open the terrace doors. The ground stretched ahead, swallowed by mist, but faint prints marred the frost-dusted grass, bare feet moving quickly, deliberately. Holmes followed them without hesitation, and we gave chase, weaving down the stone path until we reached the edge of the maze. There, at the entrance, lay another napkin. 4 candles. 3 marked. Holmes stared at it, then at the ground. "Watson," he said urgently, "this is no longer mimicry. This is an abduction disguised as ritual. She's the next." We plunged into the maze, following the trail through its winding, living corridors. The hedges loomed taller here, the air denser with moisture. At each fork, Holmes knelt and examined the ground, choosing directions with unnerving certainty. Finally, in the central glade, we found her. Miss Carroway stood motionless in her nightgown, her hair loose about her shoulders, her expression slack as though in a trance. At her feet lay a broken candle, blue wax crushed under her heel. Holmes moved to her side. "Miss Carroway," he said softly, "it's over. You're safe now." She blinked once, slowly as though surfacing from deep water. "I didn't want to go," she whispered. "I heard a voice, calling from the trees. It said, 'One more, Edith. One more to complete the third.'" "Did you see anyone?" I asked gently. Numbered just the voice. And then, silence. Holmes led her back through the maze with deliberate calm. As we reached the terrace, he turned to me and said, "It's begun to fracture, Watson. Their control is weakening. Voices from nowhere, symbols becoming action. The script is unraveling. That tells us one thing." "What?" "That the author is no longer content to observe." He paused, his voice low and sharp. "They are stepping onto the stage." Miss Carroway's condition was delicate. Holmes insisted she be taken to her chambers and left under quiet watch, with only Lavington and a maid he trusted permitted to tend to her. Holmes himself remained at the terrace for several minutes after our return, his eyes scanning the fog that still clung to the grounds as if it might part to reveal the author of the unfolding tableau. The wind had shifted slightly, carrying with it a strange hush that pressed against the windows and seemed to muffle the very air inside the house. When he did at last return indoors, Holmes removed his gloves with deliberate slowness and went straight to the study, where he shut the door behind us. "We now have 4 marked," he said, spreading the napkins across the table. "Lord Milbray, Mrs. Fenwick, the burned candle at the maze, and now Miss Carroway. But I believe we've misread one critical element." I stood by, still catching my breath from the chase. "What's that?" He tapped the last napkin. "The marked candles are not necessarily victims in the traditional sense. Each represents a transition, an act. The first candle was burned without a body, without a name. It was symbolic. The second was Lord Milbray's collapse. The third, Fenwick's disappearance. The fourth, Edith's trance and attempted departure. But no true harm has yet come to them. They have been removed from agency, silenced, immobilized, bewildered, but not destroyed. Then what's the end game?" Holmes looked at me with a sharp gleam in his eyes. "To isolate, to strip the house of will, tier by tier. Each step breaks a layer of resistance. This is no random haunting, Watson. It is a system of control." He pulled the ancestor's journal from the drawer again. Silas Milbrae spoke of a lineage pact. He named the 7 flames of penance. But the text was never clear about what happened when all 7 were lit, only that it ensured the secret would be buried in bloodless silence for a generation. I frowned. So the aim is not death, it's erasure. Precisely. Someone wants to wipe something from living memory, and they are doing so by disabling the memory itself. Holmes stood. There is one person we've overlooked, the nurse. From Lord Milbrae's room? Yes, she was present when the last napkin appeared, when no one else could have entered unnoticed, and she has been nearly invisible through all of this. Come. We found her in the East Wing corridor, quietly folding linens in the servants' closet. Her name, as we confirmed earlier, was Mary Coyle, a quiet woman of perhaps 30 with plain features and a flat voice that offered little inflection. She did not flinch when Holmes called her name, nor when he requested she speak with us privately in the dining room. She followed without protest, her hands still faintly dusted with starch. Miss Coyle, Holmes said when we were seated, how long have you served the Milbraes? Since last autumn, sir. 11 months. Were you recommended? Yes. Through Dr. Ramsay. He wrote the letter. Holmes leaned slightly forward. And before that? I was at Somerby Asylum. As an attendant, he gave a small nod, and I saw the wheels in his mind shift. And did you care for any patients who exhibited fugue states, sudden changes in personality, loss of time? Her eyes flickered, only briefly, but it was the first true emotion she had betrayed. Yes, she said. Several. Were any suggestible? A pause. Yes. Holmes tapped the table once with his fingertip. Have you noticed anything unusual in Lord Milbrae's behavior during your service here? Or in Miss Carroway's? I don't pry into the family's affairs. That is not what I asked. She looked directly at him now. Lord Milbrae would sometimes wander at night, downstairs, always to the library. He never remembered it the next morning. Holmes folded his arms. And you never told anyone? There was nothing to tell. He never harmed himself. He never spoke, just walked. Did he ever speak a name? In his sleep? A phrase? She hesitated, then said, Once. He said, Ignis Quater. I didn't understand it. Holmes rose abruptly. Thank you, Miss Coyle. You've been most helpful. When she left the room, he turned to me at once. Ignis Quater. The 4th flame. He spoke it before it occurred. That means, Watson, he is not simply a victim. He is part of the sequence. A vessel for it. You think he's being used? Yes, and I think that use began long ago, possibly with the cake. I stared at him. Drugged? Number programmed. Something planted, not physically, but mentally. Triggered by suggestion, by symbol, by presence. A voice from the trees, a pattern on linen. It sounds absurd, but you saw Edith. You saw her trance. I nodded slowly. Then someone, whoever's behind this, must have planted that conditioning. Precisely. And it would require opportunity, knowledge of the family, and enough time to build trust. That limits our suspects. I said the name before he did. Dr. Ramsay. Holmes's face was unreadable. A man who has had years to develop familiarity with the estate, access to medical knowledge, and the authority to recommend staff such as Miss Coyle, and he was present when the first napkin arrived. We need to confront him. Not yet. First, we must draw him out and observe what he does when the 6th candle burns. A knock interrupted us. It was Lavington again. His expression was ashen. There's something you need to see, he said. In the library. We followed him down the corridor, into the great double-doored chamber lined with shelves from floor to ceiling. At the far end of the room, the hearth glowed low, and near it, resting neatly upon the fireplace grate, was another napkin. This one bore only 2 unmarked candles. Holmes stared at it for a long time. 2 left," I whispered. "But the 6th hasn't been marked." "No," Holmes said. "It has. This is the 6th, but the message has changed." He picked it up gently. On the underside, in faint charcoal script, was a single line. "The flame is now within." Holmes paled. "Watson, we must get to Edith." We raced to her chambers. The door was ajar. Inside, the maid lay unconscious beside the bed, and the bed was empty. Miss Carroway was gone, and the 6th act had begun. Holmes moved before I could catch my breath, sweeping into the corridor with such singular force that even Lavington, trailing behind us, fell silent. We hurried down the main stairwell as Holmes called out instructions with crisp clarity. "Seal every exterior door. Station a footman at the servants' exit and another in the kitchen. No one leaves this house without my knowledge." Lavington nodded and vanished, the sound of his footsteps echoing behind us like a ticking clock. The air in the manor had turned dense again, pressured, expectant. A silence settled in, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for the 7th candle. We crossed to the study where Holmes retrieved the ledger from the well-house crate and reopened it to the final pages. He ran his fingers over the final 3 Latin phrases with a kind of urgent reverence, then flipped back 2 more leaves. "There," he said softly. "Ignis sexta, intra corpus, flamma vivae." The 6th fire. Within the body, the flame lives. Watson, this was never just a countdown. It was an initiation. I felt the chill even before I grasped the meaning. They've chosen her. Edith as the vessel. Yes, the narrative must be completed. 7 flames to erase the past, but the 6th must carry it forward. The pattern demands not only removal, but rebirth. In her, the legend doesn't end. It continues. She becomes the memory and the erasure. We moved swiftly to Lord Milbray's chamber. It was as we'd left it, unchanged, untouched. But Holmes now examined it not for intrusion, but for intention. He moved to the windows again, this time noting the slight smear of condensation where a hand had pressed the glass. "She came here," he murmured. To him, possibly even before she vanished. The 6th flame, the living flame, it must return to the source, to the one who carried the pact first. "You mean the ritual requires a witness?" Number A, transference. We descended to the cellar, past the servant quarters, and into the oldest part of the house, where ancient brickwork gave way to stone foundations, and the mortar between walls began to crack from centuries of pressure. The air grew colder, and the lantern Holmes carried threw elongated shadows that danced like shapes from forgotten myths. There, at the very end of the passage, we found the room. It was circular and domed with soot-darkened brick. Shelves carved into the stone walls held empty candle stubs and crumbling parchment. At the center stood a slab of slate mounted upon a base of granite. It bore the outline of a circle, etched shallow and worn, with 7 spokes radiating outward like a sun. And at the head of that slate, seated calmly upon a low wooden stool, was Edith Carroway. Her posture was still, her eyes closed. In her lap rested the ancestor's journal, now open to the final page. Holmes raised a hand, bidding me not to speak. He approached carefully, stopping at the edge of the circle. "Miss Carroway," he said quietly, "you are not alone. Whatever you've been made to carry, it does not belong to you." Her eyes opened. There was something in them, distant but aware. She did not look surprised to see us. "I saw him," she said softly. "Silas. I saw him standing in the hedge when I was a child. I thought he was just a shadow, but I remembered him last night, in a dream. Then I saw the book in my hand, and the candle in my chest." Holmes knelt beside her, voice low and unwavering. "What did he say to you, Edith?" "That it wasn't my burden, but it was my name." She touched the page. Carroway was the mother's name. Silas's child, hidden to avoid scandal. We're not just distant relatives. I'm his only living descendant. Holmes drew a breath. And someone knew that. She nodded. Ramsay. At the name, Holmes stood as if yanked upward by invisible wire. Then he's the one who lit the first fire. Not in the cake, but in your mind. I remember him visiting when I was a girl, she said. He told my uncle I suffered from night terrors, that I was fragile, imaginative. But I remember the patterns he drew. Circles. Flames. The eye. Holmes turned toward me, face set. We must find Ramsay, now. We bolted up the cellar steps, through the corridor, into the main wing. The halls had emptied. The staff sent to their posts, the house gripped in a vigil of its own. We burst into the doctor's chamber, empty. The windows were open, the fire long cold. But on the desk lay a folded sheet of parchment, its surface bearing a crude version of the candle symbol. Only one candle unmarked, the 7th. There was a signature at the bottom in trembling hand. Ignis Septimus, Oculum Clausum. The 7th flame. The eye is closed. Holmes stared at it for a long time. Then he spun on his heel. To the library. We arrived to find Lavington there already, arms folded tightly across his chest. I heard something, he said. Books falling? Then nothing. Holmes moved swiftly to the west alcove, where the shelves bent inward to frame a narrow reading nook. Several volumes had indeed fallen, some torn, one split clean in half. But it was what lay atop the pile that froze us all. A candlestick. Silver. Still warm at the base. Holmes crouched and lifted a book that had fallen last. Its spine cracked, pages fanned outward. Tucked between its leaves was a torn corner of a napkin. The edge still smoldered faintly. Ramsay was here, Holmes said. He meant to finish it here. But where is he now? I asked. Holmes stood, and for the first time since the beginning of the case, I saw true alarm in his eyes. He's gone to the chapel. We followed him down the back stairwell, through the stone passage behind the kitchen, and out across the gravel path toward the chapel that stood near the edge of the Milbrae estate, unused in decades but still maintained out of tradition, if not faith. The door was ajar. We entered. Ramsay stood before the altar, his back to us. A ring of 7 candles burned around him, one extinguished, 6 flickering wildly in the draught. Holmes stepped into the circle. No further, Doctor. The performance ends now. Ramsay turned. His face was pale, his eyes glassy and strange. In one hand, he held the final napkin. In the other, a vial of clear liquid. I waited too long, he said. Silas failed to finish it. I only meant to correct the omission. She is the end. She is the vessel. Holmes stepped closer, careful not to enter the circle of flame. You used her, built the narrative in her mind, with symbols, patterns, suggestion, but your method relied on belief, and she no longer believes in you. From behind us, Edith's voice was calm and clear. Number I don't, Ramsay faltered. She stepped into the chapel, alone, her hair pulled back, her eyes focused and unafraid. You planted it, she said, but I refused it. You used my mind, but not my will. Ramsay let out a low sound, somewhere between despair and awe. I needed the 7th, he whispered, to end it. Holmes stepped forward. You were the 7th, Ramsay. You lit every fire, you extinguished every will, and now you complete the circle. Before Ramsay could reply, Holmes moved with startling speed, knocking the vial from his hand. It shattered on the stone floor, the liquid hissing faintly as it sank into the cracks. The candles flickered and died. Ramsay fell to his knees. Holmes turned to Edith. It's over. She nodded, voice steady. Number it's remembered. Holmes remained motionless for a moment beside the shattered vial, his silhouette tall against the chapel's dim grey light. Ramsay knelt in the center of the extinguished ring, shoulders trembling, not with grief or guilt, but something closer to disbelief, as though his own story had misfired in its final paragraph. The air inside the chapel had changed. The weight that had pressed down on all of us since the arrival of that first cake now seemed to lift. Not vanish entirely, but shift, as though no longer centered in this man or this space. Edith stood with her back straight, chin lifted. There was no trace now of the dreamy lassitude that had overtaken her in the maze or the blank stillness she'd worn in the slate room below the manor. Her eyes were focused, unwavering. She crossed the stone floor slowly, stopping just at the broken edge of the circle. Holmes stepped aside without a word, letting her take his place. "You gave me the legend," she said quietly, looking down at Ramsay. "You planted it in my dreams, my childhood, my bloodline. You wrapped it in symbols and called it history. But it wasn't yours to finish." Ramsay looked up, his expression crumbling into something pitiful and small. "I was trying to preserve it, to complete what Silas began." He lacked the conviction. "I studied his journals, traced the lineage, chose the moment. I placed the cake, the napkins. I even rewrote the old rites in modern form. Psychological triggers, embedded cues. She was meant to become the flame, the vessel that ends the vigil and seals the past." Holmes moved forward, voice low but firm. "What you tried to seal wasn't history. It was your own obsession. The flames, the countdown, the legend, they were never inevitable. They were theater. You weren't continuing Silas Milbray's rites. You were writing your own, behind the mask of an old myth." Ramsay blinked slowly, hollow. "But I never harmed them. I only rearranged, induced suggestion. They were never in danger." Holmes studied him with a strange mix of disdain and cool pity. "You call it suggestion. I call it siege. A slow dismembering of the will, carried out in increments so polite no one noticed until the air itself began to thicken with fear. You built a machine of symbols and let it run loose. That is harm, Doctor, and it nearly succeeded." Ramsay slumped to the floor entirely, his palms flat against the cold stone. The final napkin slipped from his fingers and floated down beside the dead flame of the last candle. Holmes retrieved it and turned it over. The back bore no markings this time. No soot, no script. Just silence. Outside, the wind had died. The fog had begun to lift from the grounds. It retreated slowly, like a breath drawn back through the trees. We escorted Ramsay back to the manor under guard, and Lavington arranged for the local constable to be summoned, discreetly. Holmes instructed the staff to remain calm and resume their work as usual. It was essential, he said, that the spell, the atmosphere of dread and expectation, be broken, replaced by ordinary movement, by daylight and warmth and the scent of baking bread. Later that afternoon, Holmes and I sat once more in the study. The fire burned brighter now, more for comfort than defiance. Miss Carroway had joined us, wrapped in a wool shawl, her expression composed, though tinged with fatigue. "Lord Milbray has spoken," she told us quietly. Only a few words, but his eyes were clear. He asked for the window to be opened. Holmes nodded slowly. "The chain has been broken, the final act interrupted. Without the completion of the ritual, without the seventh flame being lit in the form Ramsay intended, the suggestion loses its hold. The others will return to themselves, gradually." I glanced to Holmes. But why this family? Why this legend? He opened the ancestor's journal and turned to a passage he had marked. Silas Milbray was a frightened man. He believed he could bury his guilt in ritual, erase a child's existence with ceremony. He recorded each symbolic act not to sanctify, but to forget. Ramsay found his writings and interpreted them as doctrine, but they were only fragments of a man unraveling. Edith leaned forward, her voice steady. "And yet I was raised under its shadow, in the same house, with the same blood. I thought the fear was mine, but it wasn't. It was inherited. Precisely, Holmes said. What Ramsay never understood was that symbols alone hold no power. It is belief, repetition, that animates them. You broke the pattern, not by resisting it, but by remembering fully. You brought it into the open. We sat in silence for a time, each lost in thought. Outside, the sun had begun to break through, casting streaks of light across the frost-glazed windows. The house seemed to breathe again. Edith turned to Holmes. "So it's over." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rose and retrieved the 7 napkins from the side cabinet. He laid them out across the table, one by one, in their sequence. 6 marked, 1 untouched. The 7th, Ramsay's, never completed. He then added a final item to the center of the arrangement. The page torn from the ancestor's journal, the one with the etched circle and the phrase oculum clausum. "I would say," Holmes said softly, "the legend is over, but the memory has just begun. The house has a wound, Miss Carroway. But wounds do not end a story, they begin the healing of it." She looked at him with something like gratitude, though not simple thanks. It was the sort of gaze one offers to someone who has seen too much and still chosen to remain. That night, after Edith had retired, Holmes and I shared a final walk around the manor grounds. The stars had returned above the trees, unobscured for the first time in days. The maze lay, quiet in the distance, its hedges gleaming faintly with frost. Holmes lit his pipe and looked out across the garden. "There is something deeply unnerving," he said, "about being invited into a narrative not of one's own making. Most cases are puzzles. This one was a performance, and I fear we stepped onto the stage only moments before the curtain was to fall." I considered that in silence. "But you stopped it." "No," he said quietly. "She did. I merely helped her read the script." We returned inside. Holmes paused at the study door, his hand on the knob. "Watson," he said, "there is an ancient comfort in logic, but every now and then we brush against the border of what logic cannot quite explain, only contain. This was such a case." He opened the door. The fire had gone low again, casting long shadows across the napkins laid on the desk. He closed the door behind us, and neither of us looked back. Morning brought a thin mist that clung to the trees like memory, reluctant to lift even as the first sunlight spilled over the hedgerows and onto the frost-laced grounds of Milbrae Manor. Inside, the house stirred gently back to life. The air, though still laced with caution, no longer bore the thick silence of dread. Holmes stood at the parlor window, arms folded behind him, watching the slow breath of the earth resume its rhythm. I joined him without a word, both of us gazing toward the distant chapel roof just visible between the hedges. "There's something that still doesn't sit right," I said quietly, my voice barely louder than the tick of the mantel clock. Holmes didn't look at me. "Yes, and it's been at the edge of my thoughts all morning." We'd spent the better part of the last 2 days untangling a performance, a ritual forged of forgotten guilt and weaponized memory. Ramsay was in custody now, removed discreetly under the pretense of a medical transfer, his mind already unraveling without the structure of his delusion to guide him. Edith had emerged from her ordeal, shaken but whole. Lord Milbrae, though still weak, had begun speaking in full sentences, and yet Holmes's restlessness remained. Not the usual flickers of thought preceding deduction, but a stillness that often meant something had been missed. "What is it?" I asked. He finally turned from the window. "The ledger." "The one from the well?" "Number the other, the estate ledger in the tower. I want another look at the entries for the past few months, particularly those written by Lavington." I felt a jolt of surprise. "You suspect him?" "I suspect opportunity," Holmes said, "and too many convenient absences." We returned to the tower room. The air was dry and cold again, undisturbed since our last visit. Holmes opened the cabinet, marked Current Estate Affairs, and withdrew the thickest volume. Its most recent entries were in Lavington's neat, controlled hand. Holmes flipped back a dozen pages, then forward again, eyes skimming. Then he stopped. "This line," he murmured. "Special expenditure, delivery, external supplier, September 14th. Paid in cash. No description, no initials." I leaned in. "Could be anything." Holmes closed the book slowly. "It's not the payment that concerns me, it's the date. That's precisely 1 week before the cake appeared." He retrieved his notebook and quickly cross-referenced the known appearances of the napkins. The pattern holds. Each symbolic element was preceded by silence, then delivery, then emergence. Ramsay may have designed the ritual, but someone inside the house moved the pieces. "You think Lavington placed the cake?" "I think Ramsay could not have. He needed proximity, but not exposure. He required someone invisible to the family, trusted but overlooked. The steward fits." We descended quickly, and Holmes asked for Lavington to be summoned to the study. He arrived moments later, visibly tired, his coat faintly dusted with ash from the morning fire. Holmes gestured for him to sit. "Mr. Lavington, we owe you thanks for your cooperation throughout this difficult investigation, but I must ask for your patience with one final matter." "Of course," Lavington said, though there was something guarded in the set of his mouth. Holmes held up the ledger. "This entry, on the 14th of September. What was delivered?" Lavington looked at the book, then back at Holmes. "A parcel from the city. Ramsay arranged it. I paid the courier." "What was in it?" "I wasn't told. The doctor said it was personal." "And the cake?" Holmes asked calmly. "The napkin?" Lavington's composure held for a second longer, just long enough to suggest rehearsed indifference. Then something flickered, a sliver of uncertainty, of exposure. Holmes leaned forward. "You placed it on the doorstep. After dark, you followed Ramsay's instructions because he promised you a place in the new order, didn't he?" Lavington rose. "This is absurd. I've served this house for 20 years. "Yes," Holmes said, not moving. "And that loyalty made you vulnerable. You weren't trying to hurt Lord Milbrae. You thought you were helping him fulfill a destiny, a family reckoning Ramsay convinced you had to be completed. He used your sense of duty against you." Lavington hesitated. "He told me it was about balance, that Lord Milbrae had kept a secret buried too long, that it would destroy the estate if left unresolved." "So you placed the cake," Holmes said. "You left the napkins at the window, the maze, the well house. You didn't understand all of it, but you trusted Ramsay's purpose." Lavington's voice was small now. He showed me the journals. He said Edith had to see them, that she had to remember. "And now?" Lavington looked down. "I think I helped him break her instead." Holmes stood. "Number you didn't, because she remembered, and chose to stop it. We asked him to remain in his quarters until the authorities arrived. He didn't argue. That evening, Edith joined us in the drawing room for tea. She sat by the window, the fire casting a soft warmth along her face. Holmes stood at the hearth, pipe unlit in his fingers. "He confessed," I said to her. "Lavington." She didn't react with anger, only a long, slow blink. "He was always kind to me, but too kind, like someone who already knew something they shouldn't." "You were the final piece," Holmes said gently. "But you were never his to place." She looked at him then, and there was something clear in her expression. Not relief exactly, but resolution. "I'll stay," she said. "Here, I mean. With my uncle recovering, the house needs someone, not just to manage it, but to watch it, to make sure it never becomes that place again." Holmes inclined his head. "That would be wise." Outside, the moon rose clean and silver behind the trees, no longer hidden by mist. The garden paths were visible again, even the old well house, its roof glinting faintly with frost. I turned to Holmes as we stood. "Will you ever explain how you knew Ramsay was the author of it all?" He looked at me sidelong. "Watson, it is a simple thing. The mind leaves fingerprints as surely as the hand does. Ramsay was the only one in this house who asked the right questions, just a moment too late." We left the manor at first light. Edith saw us to the carriage, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. There were no lingering words, no overplayed farewells. Only the quiet understanding that something had ended, and something else, perhaps better, had begun. As the carriage pulled away from the manor gates, I looked back once. The rising sun caught the top windows of the west tower, throwing them into sudden brilliance. And for the first time since we arrived, the house looked awake. Our train back to London pulled from the station just as the sun crested the low horizon of the northern hills, casting long bronze ribbons over the fields. Holmes had settled into his seat with a newspaper unopened in his lap, his gaze fixed beyond the window glass, though I suspected he wasn't watching the landscape at all. I let the silence between us stretch for some time before I said, "It was more than a case, wasn't it?" He did not turn from the window. "Yes, Watson, it was." I waited, but he offered nothing further, so I tried again. "You've faced killers, blackmailers, conspirators of the highest order, and yet I've seldom seen you so rattled." He gave a soft breath of amusement. "Not rattled. Grounded. There is a difference." "By what?" "By something rarely present in our inquiries. Legacy. Not in the sense of inheritance or blood or title, but the quiet, corrosive power of a story believed too long and examined too little." He finally looked at me then, and his expression held none of his usual superiority. The vigil of the Seven Flames was never real, not in the supernatural sense. There were no demons in the well house, no spirits in the hedges, but belief made it real enough. And belief, Watson, can be a far more dangerous architect than madness. I nodded slowly. Ramsay believed it, to the point of reshaping the world around it. He built a scaffolding from suggestion, symbols, sleepwalks, whispered legends, and fed them to those most vulnerable to implication. Edith, Lavington, even Lord Milbray. Each carried a piece of the narrative, planted deep and allowed to grow unchecked. It wasn't a cult in the usual sense. It was a solitary priest manipulating a silent congregation. And yet, I said, it was Edith who undid it. Holmes smiled faintly. "That is what makes this case unique. Usually I draw out a killer with logic or bait a fraud with evidence. But Edith Carraway broke the spell not by discovering a truth, but by rejecting a lie. She saw through the ritual, not because she was convinced it wasn't real, but because she chose not to let it define her." We rode in silence for a few moments longer, the countryside rolling past like the unspooling of a theater curtain after the final act. Holmes eventually unfolded his newspaper and began leafing through it absently, though his mind, I knew, was still seated in that chapel with the scattered candles. Later that evening, once we had returned to BakerStreet, Holmes retired to his chair beside the hearth, while I tidied my travel notes and tried to put the threads of the case in order. I had thought perhaps he would speak again of Silas Milbray or Ramsay, or the disturbing precision of the countdown. But he said nothing until Mrs. Hudson brought in a tray of tea, and, beside it, a small white envelope addressed to Holmes in a graceful, unfamiliar hand. He opened it with his thin ivory-handled knife and read silently. Then he passed it to me. It was from Edith. "Mr. Holmes, I write to thank you, not only for what you did to preserve the truth of my family, but for what you left unsaid. I've since gone through every ledger, every letter, and every page of Silas Milbray's journal. I understand now that he was not a mystic, but a man consumed by guilt. He chose myth over confession, and in doing so, he infected those who came after with fear disguised as fate. I have dismissed all servants connected to Ramsay's network, including Miss Coyle. Lord Milbray has named me legal steward of the estate during his recovery. I intend to preserve the manor, not as a shrine, but as a place where no more stories will be whispered behind curtains. I've also locked away the napkins. Not destroyed. Locked away. Because forgetting is no cure for a wound, but perhaps containment is. Please know you are welcome here, any time, under no pretense but that of rest. With respect, Edith Carraway. Holmes returned the letter to its envelope, then stood and crossed to the mantel, where he reached for his pipe, but paused. I should like, he said quietly, to see that library again some day, without a mystery breathing down our necks. I smiled. Perhaps you might yet find time for leisure. Unlikely, he said, not unkindly, but possible. He lit the pipe then, sending tendrils of smoke curling into the air. I leaned back, folding my hands in my lap. You know, I said, in most cases you solve the problem, identify the villain, and we move on. But this one feels different. It was, he replied, because it wasn't a matter of crime, but of narrative. Ramsay didn't murder anyone, not directly. He committed no forgery, no fraud in the legal sense. And yet he nearly erased a woman's identity, fractured a family's history, and turned a legend into a weapon. That is a rarer form of villainy. Will he be charged? Likely committed. His sanity, as I saw it, had long depended on the survival of the ritual. Once Edith broke it, he began to fracture. Holmes turned toward the fire. But it is not him I find myself thinking of now. No, he said. I think of Silas Milbrae, and how the fear of exposure led him to build a fiction elaborate enough that even he began to believe it. That is the true danger, Watson. Not lies told to others, but those told to oneself until they calcify into doctrine. The clock chimed softly behind us. Outside, the wind brushed along the windows with the barest hiss of autumn. Holmes looked up suddenly. You never asked about the cake. I blinked. The cake? The original delivery, the beginning of it all. I assumed it was Ramsay's idea. Symbolic, unsettling. Holmes nodded. It was. But the contents of the cake were ordinary. No poison, no compound. But the box in which it arrived. Now that was another matter. Double-walled. Inside the lining, beneath the cake board, were 4 strips of paper coated in a resin derived from belladonna. Subtle enough not to kill, but enough to make a susceptible person faint, hallucinate, or suffer episodes of confusion if exposed over hours. So Lord Milbrae was never drugged through his meals. He was placed near the box for just long enough to experience an episode, a carefully timed collapse to reinforce the illusion. Ramsay controlled every variable. I exhaled, and we walked into it on the very edge of the 6th candle. Quite so, Holmes said. But it will not be repeated. He drew once more on his pipe. And so, Watson, we find that not all crimes are made of blood and theft. Some are composed of fear and repetition. This was not a murder mystery. It was a war for memory. I closed my notebook. No one died, I said. Holmes nodded once. But someone lived. He gave no reply to that, only sat with his pipe and his silence, while the fire burned steadily behind. Him and the world outside our windows quietly resumed its ordinary pace. And somewhere far to the north, in a house once built to enshrine a secret, a woman sat alone, not afraid, with the candles darkened, and her own story beginning. The following week passed in a slow and steady return to routine, as though the events at Milbrae Manor had taken place in some fog-laced corner of the past. And yet they lingered, more than most. Holmes did not speak of the case in the days that followed, though I often saw him seated at his desk, his pipe cold, a blank sheet before him that remained unmarked. He was not brooding, not restless, merely still, as if the mind that usually soared ahead of the world had, for once, paused to listen to its echoes. Then, one evening, as the rain pattered gently against the windows, and the fire cast soft gold across our shared sitting room, He finally broke his silence. "There is a detail," he said, "which I did not share with the constable, nor, until now, with you." I looked up from my medical journal. "Go on." Holmes withdrew a small folded paper from his breast pocket, yellowed at the edges and stamped with the same symbol we had come to know too well, the eye encircled by 7 flames. But this version was older, embroidered by hand with a tighter stitch, its linen faintly frayed. "This," he said, laying it flat, "is not from the well-house crate, nor from Ramsay's possession. I found it in the lining of Lord Milbray's writing desk, wedged behind a false panel. It predates Ramsay, predates Silas even. The thread and weave date back to 1730. I sat forward. Then the legend was older than Silas Milbray. Holmes nodded. That was his fear, I believe. That what he had merely copied was, in fact, true, that he had inherited not just guilt, but obligation. And in attempting to erase that, he only fed the narrative further. Ramsay simply capitalized on what had already begun to ferment. He leaned back and steepled his fingers. The final deception was not Ramsay's false prophecy, nor Lavington's secret complicity. It was the idea that the vigil had a beginning or an end. It never did. It was always a spiral, a story built to perpetuate itself, through fear, secrecy, and ritual. I looked down at the napkin. "And you chose not to tell the constable. What would they charge it with? No crime to possess an old cloth, Watson, and no value in reviving a fear now laid to rest. Edith Carroway understands that better than anyone." We were quiet a moment. Then I said, "Do you think it's over, truly?" He gave a rare smile, thin but genuine. "As over as any ghost story can be. So long as no one listens for footsteps in the maze or waits for candles to light themselves, the story sleeps, as do its authors." He tapped ash into the tray and rose, walking to the bookshelf where he slid the napkin into a slim folio beside our notes from the case. "And should it wake again," he said, "we'll be listening." A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson with 2 letters and a tray of supper. Holmes opened one envelope with his long knife and scanned the contents. "A solicitor in Truro requests consultation on a matter involving forged wills and a vanishing postman," he said, passing the letter to me. "It seems the world, ever obliging, continues to produce puzzles." He reached for his coat and hat, then paused at the door to glance back toward the hearth. "And yet I think we shall remember this one, Watson, not for its difficulty, but for its shape." "What shape is that?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "A circle, naturally." We stepped out into the night, the gas lamps glowing in the misty London dark, the sound of rain soft against the cobblestones. And somewhere far away, behind locked doors and extinguished candles, a house watched over itself in silence. Not haunted, not cursed, but awake. And still.